Impact of Vikings on English, the hot pink Vikings. Churches in Europe for a long time followed the prayer, "Deliver us, O Lord, from the wrath of the northern men." This prayer was, of course, about the Vikings and the constant raids on European kingdoms. The Vikings were Scandinavian and started raiding for three major reasons. The first reason was that the Frankish Empire declined. After King Charlemagne died, his son took power and he was a poor leader. The Vikings saw this and realized that they could get rich themselves. The second reason was that the Arab caliphs were overspending, which destroyed the trade route in the Baltic Sea, which the Vikings controlled. This forced the Vikings to get money in more violent manners. The third reason is that the Viking population was growing and young people wanted to go out and explore the world. All of these reasons combined made the Vikings go out and start raiding. The Vikings had amazing ships and navigation techniques. Ships ranged from the normal long ship to the half ship and even the dragon ship. The boats all had a similarity that made them very versatile. They could carry up to 200 men and only be rowed by only 15. They were strong enough to handle rough seas and light enough to go down inland rivers. Their navigation techniques were essentially passed down through generations orally. Using these techniques in boats, the Vikings sailed seas that other people of the time would never sail. They could have been either truly brave sailors or insane sailors. For a long time, raids on England were seasonal. In the early 9th century, the raids started out small, with not many ships setting out. As time went on, the raids got larger and larger. In 840 to 841 AD, the Vikings set up a camp on English shore and camped there for the winter. This was the change between seasonal raids to camping. By the time staying the winter happened, around 1,000 soldiers, led by kings, were coming to England to raid and plunder. There were two major wars between England and the Danish Vikings. The army led by the Danes was called the Great Army, and the first war lasted from 865 to 879 AD. The second war was slightly shorter and lasted from 892 to 896 AD. The Vikings settled down and eventually accepted Christianity and assimilated into the larger Anglo-Saxon community. The Vikings helped England develop as a country by breaking the existing power. Because of this, the Wessex Empire was able to unify England.
The Vikings spoke a combination of closely related languages, which were all labeled as Old Norse. Old Norse was an oral language, which meant that it was not written down. Both Old Norse and Old English were Germanic languages, meaning that they were similar in vocabulary. This made it hard for scholars to see which vocabulary words came from which language later on. However, there are examples of vocabulary that scholars are sure came from Old Norse. One such example would be place names. The suffix "b", signifying a farmstead, was part of Danelaw. Now names like Grimsby, Aylesby, Keelby, Grainsby, and Ashby-cum-Fenby are littered through northeast England. The Anglo-Saxons had the word dole for valley, and the Viking had dollar. These two words merged to become dale, a common suffix in English. Additionally, the suffix thorp appeared, a suffix used for village. Viking influence wasn't limited to places, it also extended to people's surnames with the suffix son. Even though the closeness of the two languages frustrated scholars centuries later, there is some uncertainty on whether the Anglo-Saxons would have been able to understand their invaders, the Vikings. Logically, if the Anglo-Saxons could not understand the Vikings, they would have to learn Old Norse. However, surprisingly, Old Norse ended up adapting more to English than English adapted for it. This was most likely because Old Norse was an oral language, while English was a written language, leaving English an historical advantage. This is not to say that English wasn't influenced by Old Norse at all. Old Norse changed both English's vocabulary and grammar. For vocabulary, Old Norse added many words that had to do with violence, which isn't surprising considering that its speakers were Vikings. Words like ransack, knife, plunder, club, and slaughter all began to pop up in the English language. Old Norse also pushed out a few English words. For example, Old English's brain pan became skull. However, for the most part, Old Norse added words to the English language instead of pushing them out. When it comes to the Old Norse influence upon English grammar, Old Norse ended up simplifying the language. Before the Vikings, English was a strongly inflected language. This meant that word endings signify meanings that we now communicate with prepositions, such as to, with, and from. Vikings pretty much got rid of that. They also made pluralizing words easier, as pluralizing in Old English was extremely complicated and made communication harder. Last of all, Old Norse changed pronouns so that they were clearer. S was added to the third person singular, and the modern they and their came from the Vikings. The changes to pronouns took a while to fully enter the English language, as some Old English forms were still used in late Middle Age writings.
In addition to merely adding and changing vocabulary, the Vikings had a clear and definitive impact on the evolution of Old English into English. Namely, English in many respects became simpler. For example, lack of grammatical gender, simplified verb endings, and less frequent use of the reflexive were changes that occurred. In addition to such simple changes like vocabulary, there were more significant changes to English. For example, in many other Indo-European languages, the reflexive is often used for many verbs, not like in English. One example of this is the phrase, "My name is Robert." In English, there is no reflexive used, obviously. But in French and other languages, one would say something akin to, "Je m'appelle Robert," literally, "I myself call Robert," or "I call myself Robert." This usage is somewhat unfamiliar to us because it's something we simply do not do. Likewise, in German, one does not say, "I wash my hands," but rather, "Ich wasche mir die Hände," or "I wash myself the hands." Usage of the reflexive was not the only thing that changed and faded with the evolution of English. Grammatical gender is a concept that we no longer use. In other Indo-European languages, most or all nouns are somewhat randomly or arbitrarily assigned a gender, generally male or female, but sometimes can also be things like neutral, and plural is frequently counted as a gender. For example, French has male, female, and plural, and German has male, female, neutral, and plural. These genders do not necessarily make sense. For example, in German, a knife, a fork, and a spoon are all assigned arbitrary different genders, despite the fact that they have no biological gender, they are things. Respectively, we have a masculine spoon, der Löffel, a feminine fork, die Gabel, and a neutral gendered knife, das Messer. In English, we would use the word the to refer to all three of these objects.
English also had lost many verb endings. For example, in Old English, to love could be conjugated as follows: I lufi, you lufast, he lufad, we lufiad. But in modern English, almost all of the endings were lost, except on the third person singular, which changed to an S. So to love would be conjugated as I love, you love, he loves, we love. But that was not it for verbs. Directional verbs such as hither, thither, whither, hence, thence, and whence for Middle English, meaning to here, to there, to where, from here, from there, from where, respectively, were lost in modern English. Superlative case endings were also lost in the mix, as the superlative endings m and ost combined to form the adverb most. Another example of this kind of simplification is the combination of the adverb endings lic and e to form the suffix like. Verbs also lost their infinitive case endings and had the word to put in front of them to indicate that they were infinitive. Case suffixes on nouns, for example in German the word for man or husband is man, which is conjugated as mon, manus, but in English it is always man/husband. These were also lost during this time. In addition to this, a pronoun that refers to people in a general sense, for example, Mann in German, was dropped and replaced with the second person singular pronoun you.
John McWhorter argues that these changes happened for a reason, namely, that Viking invaders had a significant and lasting impact on the evolution of English. He argues that Vikings who settled down in English after conquering and invading had to speak Proto-English on a daily basis to communicate with their neighbors. However, these invaders were adults and consequently are not particularly good at learning language. Thus, the Vikings would end up simplifying the grammar, and then they would teach the simplified grammar to their children, perpetuating it and leaving a lasting impact.
In conclusion, Vikings began raiding the Frankish Empire, including what is now Great Britain, for 3 reasons. They saw a weakness in the leader, the trade route they controlled was broken up, and their population was increasing, which meant they needed a new source of revenue. Eventually, many of them settled in Great Britain and lived there for several centuries with the Celtic people. Since they were adults when they learned Old English, they spoke a more simple version of English that their children learned when the Vikings married British women. This impacted the next generation of speakers, and the language gradually got more and more simple as more and more children were exposed to more simplified forms of the languages. In addition, because of this prolonged exposure to the Vikings, many of their words, though often war-related, were adopted, and many of their ideas, such as place names ending with by, to define the place as a farmstead, were brought into the English language. These 2 factors combined show that the Vikings play a very important role in the changes that occurred in the English language that caused it to be similar to what it is today.